This is a lecture I thought would never come, namely the last one. I think, got involved in world history in 1983 when I became part of a world history project that produced a textbook that was never published, and I did this and that, and finally got in another textbook project, ended up with the textbook that I've asked you all to read in this course, which is The Earth and Its Peoples, A Global History. And now, having had a chance to think about and talk about every chapter and every aspect of the book over a period of 50 lectures, I'm finally down to the sort of concluding reflections on this enterprise in world history. I think that the place I would start is with the subtitle of the book, A Global History. As we were debating the table of contents and interacting with the publisher was very insistent on a distinction between world history and global history. The publisher said that within the textbook trade, world history implied a collection of discrete histories that would be for different parts of the world, and the books tended to be organized by world parts. Whereas a global history would assume an integrative approach in which different parts would be written about, but in a fashion that would integrate them into a broader, more interconnected vision of history. And that sounded good, particularly because we had decided that we were going to have a theme-oriented book with technology and the environment and diversity and dominance as the two themes that appeared to us to be applicable to all places and all times, all social situations, all political situations, and that therefore we would not have any operative assumption that there was a discrete number of polities or civilizations or societies to be covered, nor that there would be any hierarchy among them. It would be simply that we would, in a generally chronological fashion, talk about how these two themes manifest themselves and their impact on human affairs over centuries and millennia. And if some societies were talked about more than others or less than others, it would not be either explicitly or implicitly because of the ascription of some superiority to the more talked about cultures as opposed to the less talked about cultures. And the broad narrative arc through the entire book would be global integration, so that we would talk about how things started with geographical dispersion, although thematic analogies, and gradually over the course of the millennia, points of intersection occurred, and eventually we have the 20th century and the increasing, or the 19th, 20th century, the increasing reality of a world society, a world culture, and of course the magnificent concept of globalization, whatever it might mean. Now that I've come to the end of talking about this, I think that this was not a very good subtitle. That there's a problem with the notion of global history. It isn't the problem of it being a globe. I mean, the choices that you have are not between a spherical geographic entity as opposed to a planar geographical entity, for example, a landscape inscribed on the back of a turtle floating in a cosmic sea. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference because it could just be one big turtle and one globe. And yet when people thought about the Earth as a sphere, wherever they did it and whenever they did it, there were differences in their imaginings of what was on the surface of the sphere, or what was on the back of the turtle, or what was on whatever superimposed structure they imagined. What was there under heaven, for example, to think of the, sort of the Chinese concept of it. And nobody knew what was on the globe. So the notion of a global integration, of a global history, is deceptive because it suggests that the globe was always one thing, and it just took a lot of time for it to come together. If I were rewriting world history as a science fiction novel, which I think would be a good way to do it, I would have a series of planets. And they would not know of each other's existence. Each one would be a globe. You would have a globe that was the Western Hemisphere. You would have a globe that was Australia, or Australia and New Zealand, New Guinea, and so on. You would have a globe probably that would be Africa south of the Savannah belt. And you would have a globe that would be the Eurasian macrocontinent, including India and North Africa as the southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Within these globes, these planets, you would have societies that develop, that know who they are, know who else is there, interact, develop closer or more distant relations with the other inhabitants of the planet, maybe have wars, maybe have trade, but they would be separate. Okay, that's not particularly extraordinary, perhaps, as a starting point. But then you think of people from one of these globes, namely the macro-Eurasian globe, and they find out about the other planets, and they find out that those other planets have humanoid native inhabitants. And they don't know where those native inhabitants came from. They don't have the foggiest idea where they came from, because they had their own myths or scientific theories about where they came from. And they had no way of accounting for the people on these other planets. But they were there, and they were more or less like them. Whether they were of the same species was something that was widely debated. But then you have an interaction among planets, which in a science fiction novel you would call terraforming. That is to say, the people from the Eurasian globe proceeded to turn the other planets into livable homes for themselves. They had initially virtually no interest in what was transpiring among the humanoid populations of these other planets. They did know what they wanted, minerals, foodstuffs, exotic plants and animals. They didn't want the people in particular, unless, as it turned out, they could ship people from planet Africa to planet America and enslave them. But the overwhelming interest of the people on the Eurasian planet was to exploit the other planets according to their own concept of what exploitation consists of, and to either destroy or demean or ignore or try to wish away or displace the humanoids who were living in the other planets that they were exploiting. With any luck, they would all die of disease, or they could be pushed off into a reservation, or they could be enslaved. The important thing was that they not interfere with the great terraforming plans of the people from the Eurasian planet. If you read a novel like Dune by Frank Herbert, or go to the movie Avatar, or any number of other science fiction venues, you'll discover that this theme of discovery, extraction, oppression, and terraforming is one of the most recurrent ideas that speculative writers of the last 100 years have returned to. Now, they return to it because they see this as an area for imaginative creativity and storytelling. But there's also, I think, underlying it a real truth that is not often articulated. So that if you run into science fiction from eccentric locations, it doesn't have the same themes. If you read for example, the Sun City trilogy, which is the first big work of Chinese science fiction, it has it's on other planets and so forth, but you read it and you realize that it is completely immersed in a concept of a universe that is predicated on Chinese culture, Confucian values, and so forth and so on. Very little resemblance to what you would get with the European science fiction writer. So what I came to focus on as I was thinking of all this is how incredibly exploitative the Western tradition has been and continues to be, and promises to be in the future, in thinking of globalization being the final completion of the total conquest of everybody except us. Okay, that's not a dramatic conclusion to come to, but it leads to some other thoughts. For example, 200 years ago, Sumer and Assyria, for example, much less the Hittites or other peoples, were known only as names in the Bible. So that in the Bible you could run into Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar or Sennacherib, but you didn't know anything about them. They were simply names of people who were oppressing the Jews, usually, because that's the narrative of Jewish history. And then it all changed, because people discovered the languages, discovered the ruins, and invented or rediscovered or raised for interpretation a vision of a culture, of many cultures, that had not previously been known. So in the course of archaeological investigation, great libraries of cuneiform documents were discovered in Iraq, and the language was deciphered, the writing system was deciphered, the language was understood, and then we had a history. The same thing for ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptian language was deciphered. Same thing for the Hittites. There are still numerous languages for which we have surviving texts where we cannot read the text. We don't know the language, or we don't know how the writing system relates to a language. But essentially, the first half of a world history course or a global history course like this one is largely devoted to material that was unknown 200 years ago. And so we teach it and say this is the history of the world, as if we've already reached a finite body of knowledge that is this history. And then what we discover is that these histories that we have discovered that were previously unknown become bases for modern nationalism, modern definitions of identity, modern relations among states and cultures. And archaeology becomes a source, often a contested source, of modern identities, where you look back into the archaeology and you find out who you were. So that when Saddam Hussein was rebuilding parts of ancient Babylon, when he chose to put his name on each brick, he was consciously imitating ancient Assyrian practices or Babylonian practices of putting the name of the ruler on the bricks. He was trying to create himself in the image of the great ruler of the past. When the Shah of Iran, of lamented memory, who was overthrown in 1979, adopted the title Erya Mehr. He was adopting a title that means the light of the Aryans. Erya was Aryan, Mehr is light. And as the light of the Aryans, he was the modern incarnation of rulers that went back to the 5th century BC and that were totally unknown except for uncertain biblical references, were totally unknown 200 years ago. But now they become part of his identity and, by extension, his country's identity. So that in 71, when you have the Shah of Iran sponsoring a national celebration of 2,500 years of continuous Iranian imperial greatness and extracting money from everyone in the country to pay for the celebrations, it really was believed. I think that the Shah actually thought that he was the continuation, even though there's no way in the world that you have 2,500 years of continuous Iranian imperial greatness, because the Arabs came in and conquered the place and ruled it for several hundred years without the Iranians being in charge. And then the Turks came and did the same. But this was the use of history as myth. But the myth was very, the substance of the myth was very old, but the roots of the myth were very recent. You have it now in extremely contested form in Israel/Palestine. To what degree does archaeology validate the identity of Palestinians or validate the identity of Jewish Israelis. It is so disputed. We had a big dispute here, of course, with one faculty member from Barnard, but a more dramatic example was a Lebanese historian named Kamal Salibi, who wrote it actually was probably the most distinguished Lebanese historian, or at least among the half a dozen most distinguished Lebanese historian of the last generation. He wrote a book called The Bible Came from Arabia. And that was devoted to the thesis that everything that happens in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the sacred text of the Jews, refers to locations that are south of Mecca, between Mecca and Yemen, and do not refer to what we call the Holy Land. His argument was a philological argument. He said, when you take all the place names from the Torah, or even past the Torah up to the period of Judges and Kings and Chronicles, if you take all those place names and you try and find them on a map and correlate them with the archaeology, you can't find any of the places. The place names have all disappeared. You may find a place that has an old pot. You can say Jewish pot, but the pot doesn't say, I am a Jewish pot here in Bethel or something like that. It's a matter of conjecture. So what Salibi said was, all those place names that cannot be found in the Holy Land are right there on the map in Arabia, in exactly the relationship to each other that would be predicted on the basis of the Bible. So that, take one of the most dramatic ones is the case of Jordan. I looked over Jordan and saw the land of milk and honey. Now if you go to Jordan and you stand where Moses stood looking over the Jordan River, you say, am I looking at a land of milk and honey? Say, no, I'm looking at a desert, because the Jordan Valley is basically a desert. But Salibi said, in the Asir province, south of Mecca, there is a long escarpment. And the name of that escarpment in Arabic is Urdun, which is the Arabic word for Jordan. And it's not a river, but it's a line of cliffs. And if you look over the cliffs, you see a fertile valley below. And he says, that's the land of milk and honey. Now it was interesting. The likelihood of Salibi being correct hovers very close to 0. But his book was translated into many European languages and really celebrated in Europe because it's fundamentally an anti-Semitic work. In the United States, he could never find a publisher because the United States is far more committed to the integration of Jewish and Christian and other non-Jewish populations than the Europeans are, who still don't always get it. So Salibi, who had to play certain philological tricks even to write the book, I'd say, well, I asked him, you think your book is right? He said, who knows? If we ever did any archaeology in Saudi Arabia, we might find out, but the Saudis aren't going to allow that, and so we'll just put it up as a conjecture. Salibi himself, at an earlier stage in his career, maintained that the Lebanese were not Arabs, that they were Phoenicians, and that they were entirely different from Arabs, who were desert barbarians. They were sophisticated traders who had built Carthage and a great civilization. And then he went past his Phoenician stage and became an Arab nationalist and so on. So he's a flaky historian. But what he was doing is done in a less dramatic fashion by historians all the time, who are working on material, very frequently recently discovered material. or recently interpreted material, to use it to shape notions of the past that will be operative going forward. Clearly, Saleeby had in mind that if he could show that the Jews weren't from the Holy Land, then there'd be all the reason for them to leave, because it isn't their home. And it was a blatantly instrumentalist type of historical fact-mongering. Okay, so the world history that we write now is necessarily vastly different from the world history that we would have written 200 years ago, because we have found out so much more, and what we have found out has been used so dramatically to create identities and support political movements and intellectual enterprises and so forth. So that made me think, what will world history be like 100 years from now? Because after all, if the content of world history is subject to revision on the basis of stuff that's been found in the last 100 years or 200 years, then it's obvious that what's discovered over the next 100 years or 200 years has a potential to completely undermine the world history that we write now. And people can look back and look at today's world history textbooks and say, well, weren't those foolish? Now, of course, there's no way to predict what will be discovered, nor is there any reason to assume, as a necessary assumption, that we will uncover some currently unknown but profoundly important civilization, or that some language will be hit upon, some inscriptions that will change everything. And yet it would be very naive to think that we're not going to, because we're continually finding new things. This finding of new things is appreciated often very slowly in the history profession, because historians don't like to go back and rewrite what they wrote before on a different basis. I may have mentioned in this class, I can't remember, that I was, in the years when I was a junior faculty member at Harvard, where serious things were never discussed with junior faculty members. There was one meeting where we were actually invited to be part of the debate on whether African history should be taught at Harvard. And the debate was fairly lively, and there were senior professors of great dignity, whom I will not name, who argued that no, we should not teach African history in this department because the Africans did not write their history, hence there is no African history. And as I recall, I boldly raised my hand and said, yes, but if we wrote Greek history 200 years ago from the texts, and then we write it now, after 200 years of archaeology, we write a completely different Greek history. And isn't it likely that African history will emerge despite the lack of currently available texts through the increasing work being done in archaeology and other technical efforts to recover the past in Africa? And the worthy gentleman, who was actually one of the few members of the department who knew anything about African history, replied, yes, but the Greeks built in stone and the Africans build in mud. End of debate. We will not teach African history. And then about 2 years later, they hired their first African historian and deliberately had a search around the world to find the most conservative African historian they could possibly find, who would not do anything that would, in the slightest, intersect African American political interests in contemporary America. This clearly was before Harvard hired Cornel West. And yet, this is the nature of the field. It tends to be conservative and reluctant to find new things, and yet the political arena and the intellectual arena outside the academy are much more likely to grab onto something new. One thing I think that will happen over the next 100 years is that the civilizations of the Western Hemisphere will become as important as the Sumerians or the Egyptians or the Assyrians in the thinking about world history. And they will become important not just because of the accumulation of the archaeology, but because I suspect we're going to find countries that begin to rewrite their history in terms of their pre-Columbian existence, increasingly, and less on the basis of their European migration. So that countries like Peru and Bolivia and Chile and probably Mexico and the various Central American countries between Mexico and South America, I think are probably going to move away from having historical narratives that are predicated on, what the conquistadores did, and more on what was done before then, and what was great and what was impressive. And on the idea that they're still there, they're the people, and they can look back to that civilization in the same way that Saddam Hussein looked back to the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia when he put his name on the bricks of Babylon. If that is done, the whole adventure of the terraforming Eurasians coming to the New World may start to be seen in a different light. They may not be seen as the creators of a great civilization or the people who are continuing a great civilization from Europe and gifting the Americas with it. They might be seen as people who were not just destroyers of empires like the Incas and the Aztecs, but people who utterly changed everything and not necessarily for the good. It interests me somewhat that when you look at stereotypes for pre-Columbian America, whether it's in Indiana Jones or Donald Duck goes to Peru or whatever it is, Tintin, you see stereotypes of a certain type of imagery. And you say, oh, we know that. That's what the Mayan imagery looks like, or that's what Aztec imagery looks like. Well, recently I've been looking at a lot of Moche pottery. The Moche civilization was in Peru in the contemporary with the Roman Empire, and they produced, vast quantities of pottery. Pottery that shows up not just in ceremonial centers and large urban buildings, but it shows up in the small villages. It shows up everywhere in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of specimens. Some of them are hand fabricated. Some of them are made from molds. But one of the striking things about them is how realistic they are. That is to say, if you take a portrait sculpture by a Roman artist or a Greek artist, where the portrait is meant to show a specific individual, you can compare it with a portrait head in three-dimensional form of pottery from Moche, and you will see every bit as much skill of rendering something in a completely realist fashion. You don't have some sort of squat, unreadable thing with strange things sprouting out of orifices and feathers and so forth that you think of with the Mayan images. Instead, you have a totally realistic tradition. What do you do? I mean, realism has been thought of in art history as being one of the things that you gradually achieve in the course of aesthetic development. And here you have realism. So then you look farther and you say, well, what did they do with their pottery? And you see warriors, you see animals, you see people who are fishing in the sea, and you see people having sex. The most extensive, diverse, and elaborate erotic art perhaps ever made is in these moche pots. Just go to Google Images and type in moche pottery, and and don't let your kid sister see it. It's steamy stuff, and yet it bespeaks a culture that clearly puts erotic relations on a very, very different plane from those that you find in on the Eurasia planet. Now, do you simply ignore that? You say, well, Europeans came to Massachusetts and, they, burned witches and oppressed anyone who had illicit sexual relations, and that brought civilization to the New World? Or do you say, well, let's actually think about what would it mean to have a culture like that? Or what would it mean, and I've mentioned this before, what would it mean to have a culture where hallucinogenic experiences are at the very center of the culture? At the very highest levels, down to the lowest levels, a culture that believed in having hallucinogenic experiences rather than simply getting pie-eyed drunk, which is not very interesting, maybe the first half hour. So you have a different culture. And then you have to deal with the question of what do you do with a cultural heritage in which you have human sacrifice. Now, if you go to another planet and you find that the humanoids there have orgies and get completely wasted on hallucinogenic drugs and have human sacrifice and so forth, the people who are doing the terraforming try to distance themselves from that. Say, that's totally different from us. And so the Europeans invented the myth of cannibals, which isn't entirely a myth. But the idea that, well, these people on these other planets, they're cannibals, they're headhunters, they're, spawn of Satan. Everyone knows that. And so you categorize them in ways that totally dehumanize them, and you are able to ignore their culture and instead say that your values are paramount. Why are they paramount? Well, first, because they're yours, and secondly, because you're able to kill everybody who doesn't agree with you. Now, the human sacrifice particularly interests me. Were there more people killed by human sacrifice in the Western Hemisphere before the Europeans came than humans killed in the course of warfare on the Eurasia planet? Well, probably not, because warfare on the Eurasia planet killed huge numbers of people. But they weren't classified as sacrifice. They were classified as war dead. It would appear that in the New World, war dead were not nearly as interesting as people killed on the altar or killed as sacrifice. But from the point of view of the killee, it doesn't make all that much difference, perhaps, whether you were killed in war or whether you were killed as a sacrifice. It's very hard to know, except that we have fairly good indications that the sacrificed victims in the New World got stoned before they were killed, which may have been a little better than being killed in war. Who knows? But what is more striking to me is that the Eurasia planet people, when they got to the New World, what really struck them very profoundly was there weren't any animals to eat. They were going to have to hunt instead of having animals that they could simply kill and eat. The local people had never created a culture based on having captive animals that they killed and ate. The Europeans could not imagine not killing animals and eating them. It was strange enough to have vegetarians in India and elsewhere, but in those other places, at least there were some people who were still willing to kill and eat animals. Killing and eating animals was so central to what it was to be a human for Europeans that they couldn't really imagine how you could have a land that didn't have animals that were killed and eaten. Is there a relationship between sacrificing humans and sacrificing animals? The Europeans were perfectly comfortable with sacrificing animals. Killing animals and then eating them afterwards. And yet, if you killed a human and then ate it afterwards, that was barbaric, spawn of Satan. That was absolutely unthinkable. As it turns out, you now have, within the animal rights movement, a substantial feeling that there is an equation to be made between eating animals and the Holocaust. This is in a book called Eternal Treblinka. I can't remember the author's name. Nobody outside the animal rights movement reads the book, but it's terribly important to many people in the movement. Their argument is that killing the Jews is the same thing as eating steak or pork chops or whatever. That eating meat is indistinguishable from running a death camp. It's just a different species. You have one species that are cows and pigs and so forth, and another species that are Jews. But they're indistinguishable. So in this book, you'll have passages from the diaries of, or letters of extermination camp guards and officials saying, I'm working here in Auschwitz and they really serve a good steak. And then this will be as proof that there's a mental, moral conjunction between killing humans and killing animals. I made sport of this book in my book, Hunters, Herders, and Hamburgers. And I got a substantial amount of reaction that, if I do not agree with this, that shows that I am someone who is morally participating in the Holocaust. So that if you are a meat eater, you are a Jew killer. I still don't agree with this, but I do recognize that within the animal rights universe, the argument that killing humans and killing animals are the boundary between them, just as the boundary between humans and animals in speech and social organization, so forth and so on, that this boundary is falling down, and you have the notion that it's all one thing and it's all killing and it's all wrong, and everyone should be a vegan. From that point of view, those Europeans that came to the New World with their herds of cattle and flocks, flocks of sheep to eat them, were no different from excuse me, were no different from the natives of the area that practiced human sacrifice. In 100 years, it would not shock me to discover that there is a reevaluation of Eurasian culture that emerges from the blurring of the distinction between animal death and human death. And those cultures that we tend to disparage because they practiced human sacrifice in such an abundant and seemingly gratuitously cruel fashion, they may seem less preposterous. And indeed, their human sacrifice may simply be forgotten, and instead their glories will be what is remembered. Now, how do you forget that? Well, the same way that the gladiatorial exploits of the Romans are things that we know about. Everyone knows that fighting to the death in the arena for the entertainment of the crowd was not only common in the Roman Empire, but it was one of the highest things, one of the highest entertainments that you could provide. We all know that that happened. And in world history, we mention it. But we don't talk about the Romans as macro sacrificers of human lives. You say, well, they were very warlike. Martial Rome, they were warlike people. But of course, having gladiators fight in the arena, or putting someone up against wild animals so you can watch them being torn apart, or something like that, that isn't warlike. That's barbaric. But the definition of barbarism, ironically, excludes the Romans, because it's the Romans who are the ones who use barbaric to talk about everybody but the Romans. They themselves were civilized and had this quirk. If we can forgive the Romans or forget or look on Rome as a model for the past, model for the future from the past, in the way that Napoleon did when he sort of resurrected the Roman Empire, and the way in which Americans did when they conceived of themselves as sort of replicating the Roman Republic. And then you simply say, well, we'll forget about that. And this is one of the things about history, and I think I find it puzzling, is the people who know the most forget the most. But they do it in a way that is selective. It's an educated forgetting. It's a decision not to consider certain things, but only to consider others that fit into the broad story that you're trying to tell. Throughout history, this has been a a recurrent phenomenon, to try to engineer the past, to decide what will be remembered or what will not be remembered, or to decide among those things that are remembered which ones we choose to pay attention to and which ones we choose to ignore. One of the issues that came up in writing the textbook, and I believe I mentioned this before, is the question of whether people who were not heterosexual should ever be mentioned in the text. You know, it's going to be an AP text in high school. You know, you don't want high school kids to think that there are gay and lesbian people in the world because they're innocent. They don't know these things. Well, maybe they do actually, or maybe they hear it talked about endlessly in public arenas these days, but it still isn't in the textbooks because the choice of the people from the Eurasia planet was always not to mention this. And now historians come along, they're trying to recover it. Supposing you recover it, does that mean you mention it? I recall when a doctoral thesis was being written, can't remember at what university, and it was about growing up gay in Philadelphia in the 50s. And the thesis wasn't even done. And the student got an agent who was shopping the unwritten thesis around to various presses, including university presses, to try and get a publisher, because it was so desperately needed, it seemed, at that particular juncture, to know what it was like to be gay in Philadelphia in the 1950s. I know it because we considered it at Columbia University Press when I was on the publication committee. And I remember saying, well, you know, if we publish what it was like to be gay in Philadelphia in the 1950s, then does that mean we have to publish what it was like to be gay in Toledo in the 1950s? Or to be gay in, in Portland in the 1950s? Or to be gay in St. Petersburg in the 1950s? I mean, what is it about this that makes it important history? Well, of course, the book was published. And we did, at Columbia, publish a book on what it was like to be gay in Portland in the 1950s, though we didn't publish the one about Philadelphia. Because inserting the gay, lesbian, transsexual, bisexual perspective into history is now a part of the profession. And so you want to create memories and go back and find it in the history. It isn't just a matter, what I'm saying is here, it's not just a matter of archaeology producing new knowledge. It's a matter of going back into known archives and finding things that were always there, but were not singled out. There are many topics that we know that existed that we don't write about. Eunuchs, for example. Lots and lots and lots of boys were castrated and lived very important lives in various societies. We don't really put this in the history books very much, unless we actually simply put in the word eunuch, because the assumption is that high school kids don't know what the word means, and therefore you can get away with it. But we certainly don't talk about that as an industry, although it was. So I think that what I'm getting to in all this, and I really have no idea what I'm getting to in all this, but the thing is, as I think over this whole project of global history, I'm increasingly struck by how, I don't want to say capricious, because it's not capricious. It is very specifically and deliberately thought out what goes in and what is left out. Now you can say that we do this by having themes, that the theme will dictate what goes in and what gets left out. But of course every theme is subject to interpretation as to what fits that theme. I remember when I wrote the preface to the first edition, I said that on environment and technology, I wrote that that the transmission of empirical knowledge about an environment constitutes a technology. That is to say that if you know that such and such plants will cure or alleviate such and such ills or pains, that passing on that information from generation to generation constitutes a technology. And then having people respond and saying, no, a technology must be a constructed item. You know, chipping a stone is a technology, building a sailboat is a technology, designing a nuclear reactor is a technology, but simply the transmission of empirical knowledge is not a technology. And I thought that was wrong. But I could see the point, because if you say that the transmission of knowledge, of empirical knowledge, is a technology, then you can say that that magic and all sorts of religious activities, which pass as being empirical knowledge and are transmitted for generations, you can say that those are technologies. And the effort here was to separate the material world from the purely conceptual world. We now have people who go around the world looking at the ethnobotany of foraging peoples everywhere in the world. They have huge bodies of lore, mostly now passing away, having to do with what plants do what, or what animal substances do what with respect to the body. So we now, or pharmaceutical companies now send people around to try and collect that lore and test it, and if they find anything suggestive of efficacy, to reduce it to something synthesizable and turn it into a pharmaceutical product, that will be a great discovery. That will be a great discovery by Pfizer, not by the people of New Guinea. That could have been done in many respects before modern science. It's been known since Roman times at least that willow bark diminishes pain and relieves fever. It's mentioned in Roman sources, in various sources. But willow bark never became an terribly important phenomenon in Western Europe, in the Eurasia planet. But in the Western Hemisphere planet, particularly in North America, willow bark was commonly used as a medicine. So the Europeans come over, they're living among people who are using willow bark to alleviate fever and pain, and they don't use it. So then in the 1750s, a clergyman in England is walking along. This is what I believe is a true story. He's walking along and he's feeling some sort of pain. So he passes a willow tree and he breaks off a piece of bark and starts to chew it or suck on it. And he feels better. But it's extremely bitter. And his thought is, the source of quinine in Peru is a bitter bark. And quinine, we know, is a specific for the fever of malaria. So this bark of the willow is bitter. And maybe it's like that bark in Peru. Maybe it is a good medicine. It's been known to be a good medicine for 1,500 years by that time, except he didn't know it because it doesn't become general. And so he takes some willow bark and chops it up into a powder and turns it into pills and gives it to friends who have fevers, and they say, oh, it was pretty good stuff. And that was salicylic acid, which was then combined with another product from the spirea plant in order to lessen the disturbance to the stomach, and it became acetyl salicylic acid, and that's aspirin, which is, by many accounts, the most important medicine ever discovered. Now, it could have been discovered 200 years earlier if people had observed what they were doing in the Western Hemisphere planet. So the passage of knowledge from generation to generation, I think really is something that we could have subsumed under this theme of environment and technology, but we tended to not do it as systematically as we should have. But even if we had, the story of misconnections and of lack of just a simple curiosity about people on the other planets would have stood in the way. And final example that comes to mind is the Aborigines in Australia. The Aborigines in Australia have been of interest to anthropologists, ethnographers for a long time, particularly because of their adoption of animal totems and so on. And they're pretty well discussed. And then they became completely differently discussed within the last 20 years, because it was discovered that there were rock paintings in Australia that were dateable, and the dates were 30,000 years earlier than people thought. There's a debate as to whether the earliest paintings on rock in Australia go back only to 40,000 BC, or 40,000 years before the present, or whether they actually go back to 60,000 years. You get a debate on that. But the oldest modern human remains outside of East Africa, in terms of the evidence of a culture, as opposed to the bones, because we haven't found bones that old. But the oldest remains happen to be in Australia. Then suddenly, Australia becomes a topic of fascination. Humans get there so early and are so satisfied with not building a civilization that it raises this question of why, how could so many tens of thousands of years go by and still have the Aboriginal culture of Australia be what it was when the Europeans finally encountered it. As long as they didn't have a deep chronological past, they could be pretty much marginalized and trivialized. Now they have to be accounted for, because this is the sort of thing that new knowledge does. So what I'm concluding really here is that the notion of a global history, that it all comes together, is sort of fraudulent, because it's only one globe that comes together, and we still tend to dismiss and to disparage the other globes that existed at one time, that still exist, the other planets. But we dismiss and disparage the forms that they took when those forms were not consonant with the dominant cultures of Eurasia. And then I would say that in the future, this will change. And that I think we will find great questions being raised about where the central, the most important aspects of world history are, and what those most important aspects are. Though it may take another 100 years, to do it. So I'm skeptical about the notion of taking globalization as something good, and more inclined to think that globalization will have to be something that is overcome. That globalization will become what European exceptionalism was early in the 20th century, a concept that has to be overcome to recognize the rest of the world. And I think that globalization is going to become an obstacle rather than a telos, rather than a final result of world history. And how that's going to happen, I don't obviously know, but it certainly is going to raises the promise that in another 50 years we might be able to write a something like The Earth and Its Peoples. That will be not a world history, but a world's history, and that it will be very different, and globalization will be seen as as kind of a false god. Then the other perspective, of course, is that the internet will change everything, and we have another planet to be heard of, and it's going to be a virtual planet that will supplant everything we've known before. But I don't want to go there in particular. But in any case, I started out first thinking about world history in the early 80s. It's been almost 30 years. I have now taught the course once. I'm not going to teach it again, and I appreciate all the attention that you've paid me during this semester. Thank you.